I'm so grateful you guys invited me. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here and honored to have been invited. So yeah, I do restoration ecology. I started doing land management full time in about 2004 and moved to Texas in 2007 and did the conservation corps. And I worked for environmental survey consulting with Judy Walder and David Muller for a few years as an ecologist and project manager. I actually worked for the military for 1 year, 2012, managing restoration projects on the training and testing lands throughout the site. And then, yeah, since the end of 2012, I've been lucky enough to work with Austin Water, the water quality protection lands. We currently have about 30,000, a little more than 30,000 acres protected in the Barton Springs, the recharge zone of the Barton Springs segment of the Edwards Aquifer. And I work on the part of that the city owns outright. So most of that is in conservation easements. So there's landowners still out there. But I work on the part that Austin Water owns. It's about 12,000 acres. And most of that is managed as Savanna, that we also have woodland and riparian habitats. Yeah, and we do a lot of volunteer stuff normally. I host weekly events. I think whenever we go to stage 4, they'll be on Sundays. I think most weeks I'll have an event in the afternoon and then another one like in the evening, sort of mid-afternoon and then like a sunset hour kind of thing. And they're about 2 hours each. For years, we've been doing, volunteer events, mostly kind of seed-based kind of restoration. So most of the year that's seed harvesting. We'd get about 60 to 100 species, depending on the year, over the past 8 years, and about 60 to 100 pounds of native seed hand collected by volunteers. And then we put it all out in the span of a few weeks or maybe a month. And so, that would follow the cutting and burning work that our program does for Savanna restoration and maintenance. But I've found that some of the most successful restoration projects, and we'll talk about some of those in this presentation, leverage community support and kind of stick to a certain site where people can kind of reliably come back to and really develop a connection to the site and always kind of be available and attuned to the landscape for whatever the weather throws at us to kind of seize the opportunities to intervene in various ways. So our site where we're doing that now is the Mary Gay Maxwell Management Unit. This is, you can learn about this on Facebook at the Slaughter Creek Trail is the site. And then if you want to sign up for the events that we do there once a week, I think the email for this meeting has the links. And I also believe I've provided the links in the last slide of my presentation here. So yeah, we'd love to have you out if you're interested. There we go. So we'll talk about ecological reconstruction, ecological services, ecosystem services, and ecosystem interventions. These are kind of the 3 facets of restoration that we'll talk about today. So I'm making the case that savannas in the Edwards Plateau can be considered old growth ecosystems, and that savanna restoration, supports a optimal range of ecosystem services, and that growing season fire and seeding in particular are the practices that we found to be the most successful. So you can see in this map the distribution of woody plant and herbaceous cover in North America. Of course, woody plants are darker green. And so in the Great Plains, there's a semi-natural distribution of vegetation that you can see from this image. And at the southern, kind of southwestern extent of the Great Plains here, not southwestern, southeastern, we have this disjunct woodland that occurs along the Balcones Escarpment. So there's a tendency in the world for places where the climate can support woodland, but also supports natural grassland, for grasslands to be regarded as, you know, degraded or anthropogenically degraded. And so that's part of what I'm going to talk about today, is this idea that in fact grasslands have prevailed in this area for a very long time. But that's not to undercount the ecological value and importance of these disjunct woodlands, these woodlands that are not contiguous with other woodlands generally. And they disjunct habitats do tend to kind of support endemic species in this case, and in other cases, endangered species. So I think it's a really interesting system as a result of that. So the Austin area flora is remarkably well documented. We have this document from the 1920s, from 1920, a botanist at UT called Mary Sophie Young made a very detailed annotated checklist of the flora of the Austin region. And Bill Carr is now doing that same thing. He's been working on this for a few decades now. So we know what was here 100 years ago. We have a very detailed account of what's here today. Bill's annotations are very detailed in terms of the records of these various species that are here today. And so comparing these two documents, we see a gap, right? There are species that were here in 1920 that are either no longer here or are very rare. And so I kind of make that a guiding, those documents are kind of guiding for our seed-based restoration on the water quality protection lands. An example here is the wild hyacinth. Here's from Bill's checklist. He says, at the time of Mary Sophie Young in 1920, wild hyacinth was abundant along railroad tracks and in other open ground where the soil is deep, one of our conspicuous spring wildflowers. And Bill's, assessment at this point, its status has changed considerably during the intervening decades. Wild hyacinth, while still conspicuous where present, is now one of our rarer species. So we had a volunteer harvest some of this on a roadside almost a decade ago, and now there are 6 or 7 different sites on the WQPL where we have, small stands, but growing gradually, depending on the year. So that's the kind of thing that we're trying to do with this seed-based restoration. I think a lot of our degradation that we see today in Texas grasslands may be associated with overstocking, particularly during drought. There was a guy who was he worked for the Interior Department whenever Teddy Roosevelt was the Secretary of the Interior Department before he became president. And he was going around giving talks and introducing the concept of range management. At the time, and still, the idea is that you can tell the condition, you can interpret the condition of the range that you're managing livestock on based on the composition of the flora. And so he gave this talk at a meeting for the Texas Stockman Association or whatever it was called I think it was in the San Angelo area. And they made a resolution after his presentation. Resolved, none of us know or care to know anything about grasses, native or otherwise, outside of the fact that for the present there are lots of them, the best on record, and we are after getting the most out of them while they last. So I think this attitude was one of the drivers that led to the current need for restoration. The most recent transition to woody plant dominance, another, so sorry, I should unpack that a little more. So overgrazing, of course, would favor woody plants over herbaceous plants. Herbaceous plants are getting the pressure of grazing animals. Of course, this whole system evolved with large grazers. However, they could move around whenever there was drought in ways that were not happening with managed livestock, especially after barbed wire fences. So we had some soil loss, though a majority of the soil loss we see evidence of today probably happened much earlier. We also had woody plant encroachment and invasive grasses. Invasive grasses were introduced to stabilize soil, of course. And, you know, in retrospect, we might think, oh, this is terrible, decades of ecological damage, but I might rather have some soil still sticking around than not, though invasives do present an insidious challenge. Anyway, yes, the most recent transition to woody plant dominance was well underway by the early 20th century. So here's William Bray, 1904. It is of fundamental importance to note that the type of vegetation in this region is undergoing change. This change, broadly indicated, consists in a transition from grass to woody growth. This is apparent to the casual observer. Everyone has observed how mesquite captures open pastures, and many have watched scrub oak timber occupy uplands that were formerly open prairies. Another one is from Foster in 1917. You know, same kind of statement. It is safe to say that fully 50% of the grassy uplands of the Edwards Plateau is now occupied by some form of woody growth. So in their lifetime, this was an observable phenomena. We can go back further. There's various sources of, older sources of evidence. Some of those are very recent and high quality, have been discovered recently. This is from Friesen Cave in Bexar County. So Edwards Plateau savannas of the last glacial maximum were comprised of largely the same genera we see today. So Juniperus, Quercus, those are shown here in the Eastern Edwards Plateau. And then the families Asteraceae and Poaceae are today responsible for a lot of the herbaceous diversity in the region. This is the most recent of these kind of studies. We have Ernie Lundelius is one of the authors on it. And, you know, in a nutshell, these quotes basically say, during the last glacial maximum, the Edwards Plateau, or at least Hall's Cave and the area around Hall's Cave in Edwards County, so pretty far west of here, appears to have been an open prairie, much deeper soil than today, lots of large grazers, grass dominated, very few woody plants. Then during the Balling Alarod period in the late Pleistocene, increasing woody cover and fewer grasses. Then during the Younger Dryas, incredible amount of soil loss, much more soil loss than we've seen more recently with overgrazing. This is when we lost all of the burrowing mammals. And then in the early Holocene, there's a shift back to increasing woody cover. So these oscillations in woody cover, according to this study from 2020, which uses ancient DNA, were associated with changes in climate. They also make the case in this paper, which I believe was a change of tone from Ernie Lundelius, the great paleontologist from UT. They say that, you know, the diversity in the vegetation recovered whenever there were these massive ecosystem collapses, such as at the end of the Younger Dryas. However, the megafauna never did. And so they're saying that this is further evidence from what's known as the Pleistocene overkill hypothesis, the idea that human habitation caused overhunting, overharvesting of large mammals. In Edwards Plateau savannas, in the rest of the Great Plains, as in the rest of the Great Plains and Southwest grasslands, oaks, peepal, grasses, charcoal, and soil carbon are correlated during the Holocene. So, you know, this HO, this is also from Hall's Cave, means human occupancy. HIO means intermittent human occupancy. And they're using arrowheads to make those classifications. You see increased charcoal, so there was more fire when there were people on the landscape, increased soil carbon, increased oaks, and more consistent grasses. And that's a pretty normal phenomena from the Edwards Plateau, from what I can understand. I'm sorry, from the Great Plains. Another way that you could interpret ecological antiquity is through endemic species. And these are, of course, important conservation targets. Now, I should back up a little. This study in the, this is ancient DNA from Hall's Cave. They make the observation that these are no analog biotic assemblages. So I'm not saying that the flora or fauna of these ancient ecosystems were exactly what they are today. Some of the genera and diversity within the families appears to be constrained, but these are no analog systems. So, and novel assemblages, like species that occurred together during the last glacial maximum in the Edwards Plateau, do not occur together today. So when we look at endemic species, the idea behind using endemic species as an indicator of ecological antiquity relies on that they may have evolved in situ or in that place, which there's really no evidence for in this case. But it is still, I think, people find this a compelling case. Like, for example, in the North American coastal plain, where there's very high rates of endemism in disjunct habitats, that's kind of evidence that they may have evolved there. Either way, when we look at the endemic species, these are endemic to the state of Texas, but largely occur within the Edwards Plateau. This is what this list is. And this is just plants. About half of them grow in full sun, and the other half grow in like some amount of shade, full depart shade. Actually, almost none are truly full shade, but you know what I mean. So another important concern here guiding this topic is that grassy biomes are the most endangered in the world. Now, I think that little gray outcrop they show in terms of these crisis ecoregions on this map, that looks to me kind of like the Edwards Plateau, that shape and that place. But nevertheless, we are supporting a grassland ecosystem, and this is the largest biome in the world that is critically endangered, according to this pivotal 2005 study. And we have a lot of the same species. And here's an example with birds. I put stars next to the declining bird species that are just common on the WQPL. So we're kind of serving a related mission. Another benefit we get from grassland restoration and savanna restoration in the Edwards Plateau is a benefit in water yield. I think this is, considered a controversial topic to some. And I think that the apparent equivocal regional data that people are interpreting comes from just natural variation in the system. So these regression lines are comparing annual evapotranspiration, so water lost to the atmosphere from plants, open water bodies, and soil surfaces in woody plant dominated systems is the solid line, or forest, I guess they're calling it here, and then grass is the dashed line. So when you get to really high rainfalls, these lines are really far apart. But we're something like 900 millimeters a year of annual rainfall, and the points kind of overlap, and they're not that far apart. So it's a pretty modest amount of water that we can gain by reducing woody plant cover. But it's not nothing. And there is still a difference, this cluster of points in the grass is generally below this cluster of points for mixed veg, or certainly the few cases of actual forest here. So the relationship between veg cover and evapotranspiration is complex in these kind of marginal climates like ours. I'm working on a collaboration with Brad Wilcox right now and kind of summarize how veg cover impacts water yield in these semi-arid and subhumid karst systems worldwide. That's what we're now talking about. But anyway, there's kind of all of these conditions that get to whether or not changes in veg cover are hydrologically sensitive. Regional literature does confirm this relationship, though. I think there was an accidental an email that went out to promote my talk saying that I was going to tell you about how junipers fill the aquifer, I would not give that talk. It was kind of funny though to me, because I am so involved in that debate. But yeah, here's a study. This is from 2006, showing that the difference in water yield probably comes from winter, right? Woody plants are able to use water more in the winter than grasses are. And that probably is in part, at least, because of the C3 photosynthetic pathway of juniper, and C4 grasses dominate in the summer. Another one, this one's from Honey Creek. This is the best, I think, kind of the gold standard method for a paired catchment water budget study. Involves an evapotranspiration tower or an eddy covariance tower. And on this site at Honey Creek, they had one of those for a decade. So the purple is average annual potential groundwater recharge in percent, and it goes from 17 to 24 in the treatment watershed, and compared to the 14 to 13, basically the same in the reference watershed. So that's kind of our best piece of evidence. That's not a huge amount of water as a percentage of rainfall. It's something like, 40 or 50 millimeters. So like 0.5 of a centimeter per year. But relative to the aquifer, it's a significant amount of water compared to this study. And that's apparently pivotal for this issue. Here's another one. This is from back in 1998. They also had a simpler version of an ET tower on this one. They call them Bowen towers. And you can see evapotranspiration as a proportion of precipitation is much higher in the untreated, but just for a few years. So there's apparently this competition release effect where the remaining woody plants, or actually grass recovery, they claim in this study, starts to catch up and use that extra water. So it's a kind of a modest and fleeting benefit to water yield. That's not nothing. I was talking to Brad, who's one of the leading researchers on this topic, on Friday last week, and we kind of agreed that this is not an amount of water that can rescue a major city from climate change, but it probably could buffer a local aquifer from deepening droughts. That's how we think of it on our land management and the water quality protection lands. And this is not at all a case to, get rid of all the juniper or something, right? This is a modest benefit to water yield. We shouldn't ignore it. We shouldn't deny that it's there. It doesn't overwhelm stuff like endangered species habitat, carbon storage. People recreationally want to use woodlands. They're shady and cool. They also, via the same process, could buffer flooding risk. Again, it's not a major effect, but there are ecosystem services from woodlands as well that we want to recognize. This should also, savanna restoration treatments should also mitigate wildfire risk. I had long been under the belief, had the belief that maybe this doesn't matter a lot because the savanna ecosystem is dominated by fine fuels, so it's more flammable, whereas a wooded ecosystem is dominated by woody fuels, and so the fire intensity, severity are much higher, but it's less flammable. However, increasing research is kind of piling up, and it actually feels like, it's actually clear that it makes a really big difference for intensity and severity, and that those are the fires that we can't really control. Those are the fires that can threaten a neighborhood or a watershed or a significant carbon stock. So this research is a meta-analysis, 1,200 studies, and they find a really significant treatment effect if you reduce fuels in grasslands. Rearranging fuels in woodlands actually puts you on the wrong side of fire severity. So that's if you go into a woodland, cut down a bunch of trees and put them on the ground and leave them there. And then a wildfire comes through, your severity is worse than it would have been. This next one, study group 3, is if you cut woody fuels but then remove them. So like putting them in a chip truck and hauling them off, or burning them, but it's still a woodland, so you still have a lot of woody fuel left after. Study group 2 is cutting trees but leaving them in a grassland, and 1 is what we do. We cut trees and then use prescribed fire. So despite those kinds of treatments, woody plant cover has gone up on the water quality protection lands. We bought the lands mostly starting in 1998. On this map, it's not updated. We bought some stuff since then, but on this map, the blue lines are the fee simple. That's the stuff that I manage. And the green is conservation easements. We have other conservation easements that are further from Austin, but just for reference, can you guys see my cursor, the little arrow? Well, anyway, the northernmost unit there.
Yes, we can see it.
Great. Okay, so it is now pointing to the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. So that's just for reference. So yeah, we bought the lands in 98. The dark, this is tree cover. The dark red is 70% or greater woody plant canopy cover. And this is from digital ortho images. And, you know, it's a pixel-based semi-supervised method to quantify canopy cover at large scales that I did last year. And so, you know, our largest management unit is this Onion Creek tract, something like 3,400 acres. You can see we've burned and cut about 20,000 acres over the past 22 years. So almost 1,000 acres a year. And you can see the map on Onion is significantly darker now than it was in 1988 when it was still cattle ranching, or 1998 when we bought the land. So we haven't really reduced woody plant cover. In fact, we've kind of held steady. But you can still see from these maps what we have achieved in terms of grassland restoration and maintenance, because a site like, for example, this one is we call it our Hayes County Ranch. Really need a new name for that one. It's all in Hayes County almost. This has been managed actively during that 22-year period. This piece is called Rogers, and we just bought it during the pandemic in the past year. So that's what those two looked like in 98. And here's what they look like now. So up here, we've got golden cheek warbler habitat. This is 2018, so woodland has increased a lot. A lot of really nice grassland in here. This is actually mainly dominated by big blue stem, and it's the best of that kind of habitat that I'm aware of in the Austin area. And then Rogers, you can see it's almost completely wooded in 2018. So we prevented that trajectory. So here, the 1998 Rogers tract to now probably would have happened on all of these sites that are, you know, have more woody cover. We're not trying to get it complete down to zero, but they're far less wooded than that Rogers tract today. This isn't a great way to depict this, but treatment frequency is a marginally significant predictor of canopy cover change. So these categories are the number of days between treatments. So this is like 1 day to 4.5 years. We get, you know, the median, the average effect, the mean effect is below 0. And this is woody plant cover change. If you do between 4.5 and 6 years, you're pretty much maintaining. And if you do a treatment return interval, so either cutting or burning, of greater than 6.5 years, you know, woody plant encroachment continues. Another way to look at the impact of that work is in plant diversity. So the presence of ash juniper significantly reduces surface level plant diversity. So here's a prescribed burn where a no-lina burned so hot, it took out a few junipers around it. And this is less than a week later. No rain event in that interim. And this was a July burn, late July 2016, this incredible bloom. There were pups I guess they weren't pups. They were new seedlings all around it for a little while, but at some point it got hot enough and they all died. And then this plot on the left just shows richness. So we all are familiar with this dynamic. So the most common richness, so the number of native species under juniper shade is well less than 10, and the mean is well less than 10 too. We see some higher values here, and that's because I've been doing these transects for the past decade and others before me, so it's more than 15 years now. And even when there's like one juniper out in the grass or a small one, if we do a transect observation under that plant, that counts as juniper shade. So that explains some of the higher richness in juniper shade on some of our transects. But the mean species richness, anywhere that's not under a juniper, so it could be under an oak, could be full sun, is much higher. So in the mid 30s in terms of plant species. So that's really most of our diversity, of course, resides in the sun. This is just woody plant response to various treatment interventions we've done. So this is kind of a covariance way of looking at vegetation data. So the horizontal axis here is total woody plant cover before treatment, and the vertical axis is after. So if a dot lands directly on this black line, that means we have the same exact woody cover on that transect before and after treatment. And the colors, blue means no treatment, right? So when they're above the line, and this blue regression line indicates that woody plant cover increased. And anything below that black line indicates it decreased. So anyway, cutting and burning are both effective. This image, the image on the lower left, this shows, a small stand of juniper burned in a fire, and our volunteers had collected, what is that one? Vigira dentata, Plateau goldeneye. And that's kind of one of our best performers. Blooms in the fall. It tolerates a wide variety of a wide light gradient. It can tolerate full sun or some shade. And so that's important for savannas. It provides this ecological interactivity of a fall pollen source. And it also can kind of it can thrive in this dynamic gradient, a light gradient that occurs in savannas that are actively managed. And it's fun to harvest, and it germinates very well. Apparently, it just performs well on our seeding treatments. So this is the kind of thing, if you come out to our volunteer events, we'll go look for spots that burned hot and we'll apply seed. But there's a whole process of monitoring plants for seed ripeness, and then harvesting, and then cleaning, and then mixing. So it's really fun, and you should come out. This shows growing season fires are more effective at reducing woody cover compared to winter fires, which are effective for maintaining woody cover at short return intervals. So that blue regression line lands right on we call it the 1-to-1 line. So this is counterintuitive for some people, but that black line, again, if a point lands on it, it means woody cover was the same before and after treatment. And that blue line landing right on it shows that on average, winter fires over about a 2-year monitoring return interval maintain canopy cover levels. By contrast, growing season fires, so here I'm defining that as kind of April to October, reduce woody plant cover over a 2-year monitoring return interval. And here's a neat one. So we had a fire that it was probably in the top 3 or top 5 most intense fires we ever did. And we followed it up. And so you can see we reduced oak and juniper canopy. And nearby, there was a spring. And this is close to it, top of the hill, not right at the top. And so some volunteers seeded bushy bluestem, thinking, okay, it's really sunny now. We don't have a sunny seed bank on this site. And there's spring flow here during wet periods. And bushy bluestem just took over this whole management unit over the following years. I mean, not the whole thing, maybe 20 acres though, in a much drier habitat than you would expect bushy bluestem. So, you know, there was a series of really wet years we had. Maybe this one is turning out to be one of those with that nice summer we had. But anyway, so that stand of bushy bluestem is not so thick as it is now, but this used to be a depauperate community with a lot of shade, and where it didn't have shade, it had a lot of KR. So when we do growing season fires, KR goes down, light availability increases, and we can get this kind of self-organized plant community comes from our high diversity seeding interventions. This graphic, we don't have a really strong effect from any particular treatment regime in terms of species richness. In general, all treatments benefit diversity, but growing season fires are the most effective. So those red dots are the ones that are, you know.
No, I'll be out of town.
Oh, okay. All right.
I will be out of town. So have a good time.
All right. Well, take care, Gloria.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So, yeah, over the line, that means richness, the number of plant species observed, went up. And I think this is generally occurring across our site as a long-term response to having removed livestock. We don't have any grazing animals, and we haven't for 20 years, except for, you know, white-tailed deer and stuff like that. Here's another case of what we get from seeding. So this was a burn pile that probably was made in the 80s. It looks like some cutting had been done before we got the place, and there were these old piles of juniper. And we went and applied seed. And so, you know, we've got really nice little blue stem dominated savanna all around it. These kind of hot spots that come from burn piles would normally take a while, or a longer period at least, to become revegetated. So we went in there, and I think, oh, what's that velvet leaf mallow, but it has bigger leaves. Yeah, I guess it's just velvet leaf mallow. And then slim tridents, there's aristida, there's plains lovegrass, side oats, all of this stuff that, you know, mainly you can't get it from commercial sources. This comes from wild harvested sources. And that's less than a year after that burn. Here's a recent publication I got to co-author. You'll recognize some of these names from the Wildflower Center. We chose, you know, a high quality remnant. We called it our old growth plot on the water quality protection lands, and compared it to the long-term study plots on the Wildflower Center that many people volunteer for monitoring. And we see higher species richness per square meter on growing season burn plots than other treatments. However, there's a similarity index. And so old growth grasslands are still distinct from all these restored sites. Generally, the Wildflower Center, when they got the place, you know, juniper and King Ranch bluestem dominated, exotic invasive old world bluestem dominated. So even though you see some differences with these different treatment regimes in terms of species richness, definitely in terms of King Ranch bluestem, there's still something about those old growth plots and its species composition. They're dominated by big bluestem Indian grass, liatris. Apparently they're not more diverse, but we chose those spots because the floristic quality was high. And that's, of course, a subjective judgment. But yeah, this is a really encouraging image. You know, this plot on the lower left shows King Ranch bluestem cover as a %, and their summer burn plots are statistically similar to the old growth grasslands in that, you know, so repeated growing season fires from this study appear to really, you know, correlate with low levels of invasive grass. So here's a couple of images of our seed collection stuff. I think that's the Engelmann sage, somebody collecting the seed from there. There's kind of our end of year seed mixing ritual. We now have a little apartment on one of our tracks, the Onion Creek Management Unit, dedicated to seed storage and cleaning and processing. So we're hoping once COVID is going to end, because it's going to end, right? Or something, to get volunteers more involved in that. But we have this shaker table, and it's a reciprocating saw with a screen, and you put the seed in there and the good stuff falls through. And a whole bunch of homespun and similar things now. So people go around year round. We've now automated this so that it's in iNaturalist. We have an iNaturalist project. So you can go alone, you can go with a group of volunteers or just your friends and family or whatever, and go around these protected lands that are generally not open to the public except for educational purposes and guided hikes, and look for cool plants and just record their ripeness condition of the seed. You know, this number system I developed for doing this has proved robust over the years. And then, you know, years ago, I made a list of targets, and these were kind of the categories that I would use of why we're going to target some plants for seed harvesting, but not others. So KR resistant, I kind of just mean any species that can coexist with KR. It's not likely to get invaded instantly. That's one of the reasons. And examples are silver blue stem and Indian grass and little blue stem. And I mentioned that Plateau goldeneye. Underrepresented, that goes back to that comparison between Bill Carr's checklist and Mary Sophie Young's checklist. So we have probably 40 or 50 species that we've identified that Bill Carr says are rare now, and Mary Sophie Young said were common 100 years ago. C is a fall bloomer or otherwise helpful to wildlife. And then Savanna specialist, I'm basically saying it's not technically correct to call it a Savanna specialist, but it's a kind of a catch-all term for these kind of valuable characteristics. They can tolerate some variation in the light regime, which we expect going forward. And or they can carry fire, you know, and that's true of generally just all graminoids. And any species that's on my target list, it's just stuff that we've seen perform well in the past or underrepresented. I don't have good information about that category. Here are what people are looking for when they do this ripeness monitoring. This is there's David Mahler co-authored this chapter. I think it was in the mid-90s, chapter in the Tallgrass Restoration Handbook. The name Stephen Packard will come up again later in this talk. He was one of the editors. So you're looking for these 4 conditions to make sure that seeds are ripe and ready to pick. Full size, coats are changing color, stems are dry, and the earliest form seed is dropping. I'm also working on a floristic quality index for the eastern 2/3-ish of the Edwards Plateau. So I've kind of identified the rainfall gradient. Actually, no, I didn't do this. Kelly Cruz and Shubin Yang at UT identified the part of the Edwards Plateau that is climatically capable of supporting closed canopy woodlands. I think they identify that as 70% woody plant cover or higher. And it turns out to be associated with a rainfall of 660 millimeters per year or more. So here's some of the sites. I mean, a lot of these points don't have names showing up on this map. I have way more sites in here. I just showed it on a map to show the spatial extent of the area. And we've got a group of botanists assembled to provide subjective conservatism coefficients. I'm running out of time. So I'll just say really quickly, that's just a subjective estimate of its fidelity to remnant habitats. So I'm showing a picture here of golden-eyed phlox. That's an annual, and it's also fairly common in many places. but I think it has a pretty good, I haven't gotten these reviews, these numbers back yet, but I think it probably has a pretty good conservation coefficient because it tends to occur in native grasslands. And so we've got Bill Carr and Jason Singhurst, Minette Marr, Charlotte Remps, David Mahler, David Lemke, a number of other great botanists contributing their assessments for C values, conservatism coefficients for about 1,300 different species that occur in this area of the Edwards Plateau that can support closed canopy woodland, but also supports natural grasslands. I think that the master list came from floral inventories from about 20 sites on TPWD and Nature Conservancy and et cetera, all these different sites that had a good floral inventory and that represent semi-natural conditions. So here's another, this is from, I think, 2020. I think this came out during the pandemic. This is a paper documenting, this is, I think, the only case that I know of a restoration project that leads from a degraded grassland state to high enough floristic quality that it's basically tied with the best examples of remnant habitats for that region. So this is from Illinois. I think it's the Chicago area. Stephen Packard has been leading a volunteer effort out there. I don't know, I shouldn't even single out an individual because there have been hundreds of people that made this happen over the past 30 years. But you can see these are C values, mean cover per plot. Look how much those high C class values went up over that 30-year period. So, and this is like a group of dedicated volunteers working on some 200 or 300 acres over the course of decades. So we want to promote restoration as a recreational land use because that is apparently the only way that I'm aware of that degraded grasslands have ever been restored to be basically as good as remnant grasslands. This was a challenge for a long time in restoration. Like, is it possible to get one of these degraded sites to be the same as a remnant site? It wasn't really shown, and this is the first glimmer of hope that I'm aware of. If other people are aware of other examples, please let me know. Some neat work from Camille Parmesan and others about, this is basically, the idea is, you know, people connecting with nature and doing so with mindfulness practice leads to like a more improved felt connection with nature. So kind of thinking along those lines, but running out of time. There's so many cool books on the kind of stuff that I'm talking about today. And here's some of my favorites. And yeah, there's the page where you can sign up for the events, and please contact me with any questions or comments. I don't know if we have time for questions at this point. I ran a little long. Sorry about that.
Devin, could you go to the slide before that so I can at least see the books again? Sorry, Alice.
Yeah, no, in fact, I was about to ask the same question because I tried taking a picture and it, yeah, so.
And yeah, we sure do have time for questions.
Grasslands. Oh, E.O. Wilson.
That was a lot of information to present. I think you overwhelmed us.
I thought it was fascinating. It was so interesting.
Yeah.
And it kind of was a good segue from the talk that we had last month about the mountain cedar. And here where we were, you know, Devin, you were focusing on degraded grasslands, and yeah, very interesting how they tie together. So we do have
so glad you enjoyed.
There. how much is deer management part of these efforts?
So we managed deer actively from 1998 to 2014 and did annual surveys. And we saw a difference in plant composition. And after we ended the culling program, after 2014, so during that period where deer were actively managed, we started to see more soapberry. That was the clearest indicator. It didn't translate to any change in woody plant cover. The reason they decided to stop it was because it was so, frankly, politically unappealing. Council members were asking questions that threatened our credibility as a program, it felt like at the time, to the people in charge at the time. And so, you know, since then, still a lot of soapberry. And I think part of the justification for ending the program was that the numbers were the same all the time. So it seemed like, you know, during hunting season, they would remove a couple hundred deer from these 10,000 or so acres. And by the time they did the next survey, the population will have recovered. So it comes to equilibrium with the surrounding landscape. So there seems to be a seasonal period where there are fewer deer, and that affected plant composition favorably. You know, it wasn't like really obvious, the effect, you know, we saw more soapberry that, you know, with culling. But generally, I think the landscape is dominated by impalatable species, and a transition away from that without active intervention would take a longer time than we had to do so. Our current management plan that we're working on now formally enshrines that we're not going to manage deer anymore. And, you know, I'm not thrilled about that, but this is the pressure we are getting from the city council. We did, I mean, on a positive note, you know, we've got probably 6 or 7 credible reports of mountain lions over the past 20 years on the water quality protection lands, but only in the past year did we have a picture of a mama with cubs on a game camera image.
That's pretty cool.
Good.
What about wild hogs?
Yes, there we go. Thank you.
Water quality protection lands got a picture of a mountain lion with cubs this year.
Yep. Actually, it was a neighboring ranch, but we saw the photo. It's real. It's from Hays County. Yeah, we take about 200 hogs a year. I don't know why that's not a problem for council, but they let us do that still. I don't see any difference. I mean, there are more hogs every year. But I will say that the impact on the 12,000 acres, it's negligible. You know, I think locally it could be a bummer if you saw 10 acres of riparian habitat torn up. That's bad news. We don't want that. But largely, you know, our restoration efforts can proceed just fine, even though there's some critter going around rooting stuff up. It probably in places, you know, say we do a burn and then wildlife activity increases on a burn unit after a burn. Turkeys, elk, whatever you can think of. There's just more of everything after a burn. And so it's a sensitive time. A lot more of the landscape is bare. And so in those cases, you probably do see, you know, enough hog damage that it's bad news. I wish we could keep up with more, but we've got a few guys on it full time and they can take 200 a year. So that's what we're living with right now.
Looks like there was a question on what type of qualifications do your volunteers have?
Oh, so anybody can sign up for regular volunteer events that are hosted by staff. annually in the late summer or early fall, we have a training for land stewards. And when you go through the land steward training, it's a half day on ecology and plants and whatnot, and a half day on what to do if something bad happens, first aid, etc. And then you're free to go, do volunteer events on your own or to lead events. And that's how people who get really involved with the seed work can do so. I really recommend, though, the hosted events as a really good training opportunity. If you want to do the land steward program, the people that do well and stick with it are already familiar with our work by going to the events that are hosted, which have a strong educational component. Some people just show up for the training and become land stewards and then try to do work independently, and that generally does not last.
Okay. And so is soap berry a particular indicator of deer, do you think?
I think it just indicates the kind of palatability of the landscape generally, but that's the thing that came back when we started to manage deer. So David Mahler has a list he's been working on for a few decades of palatability, and these are rankings just based on his field observations, and it's pretty medium. It's pretty aromatic. It's not super palatable, but the landscape is dominated by impalatable species because of historic overgrazing, because of high white-tailed deer. So yeah, it just shows, I think,
Are there any other invasive animals that you have trouble with?
Can't think of one right now. The main invasive is the old world bluestems, king ranch bluestem, silky bluestem, Kleberg bluestem. And then, yeah, hogs is the only animal that comes to mind.
Is silky a pretty invasive plant in our area? I happened to see it one time when I was helping some people identify the plants on their property out near Purnell State Park.
You know, it can be. And we had this interesting pattern. We started to see it on multiple transects for the first time in 2007. It blew up in 2012. And it had been in the hill country for 4 decades already in Guadalupe County. And
Sorry,
go ahead.
I didn't hear what plant.
Silky bluestem, Dichanthium sericea.
Thank you.
It blew up in 2012, and I've never seen anything like this. There were large stands of prickly pear dead because it had been outcompeted, smothered with silky bluestem. Since then, this is a strange pattern. It now forms mixed stands. So where you get king ranch bluestem forms a monoculture, you know, there can be an initial flush of silky bluestem, especially in forb or cactus dominated areas, but then it sort of settles out and forms a mixed stand over time. I don't understand what's going on there, but I've heard others describe the same pattern. So yeah, I mean, it can definitely have a negative impact. But it's not the monoculture forming kind of thing that is very persistent with the other ones, king ranch bluestem, and even more so Kleberg bluestem.
Yeah, and you said that the growing season fires were best for keeping KR bluestem under control and increasing the species that we want. Is that correct or not? I can't.
Yeah, I mean, it's an active area of research. The thing that I think describes the impact the best, that syncs with my anecdotal experience the best, is if it burns during early seeding, when it's only something like a quarter of the plants have seed on them. That's the time when you see the most mortality. So Kelly Lyons in San Antonio published something like that from controlled experimental evidence 10 years ago. I've seen it play out a million times, but if you look at the broader set of literature on that topic, it's very variable, and all that variation we see in the data is not well understood or explained so far. There's generally, you don't see this effect with winter fires. that does not really seem to do much to KR, as far as I know. But other sites, like we did a burn on the same day at Fort Hood and on the water quality protection lands in 2007, I think. And the Fort Hood site went from over 80% KR to less than 10%. And then they published on this in 2018 or 19 maybe, and the Fort Hood site was still low. The water quality protection land site went from 60 something to 70 something. It just, actually I should say it went from 60 something to 20 or 30 something and then back up to 70, all within about 3 years. And I think that rapid recovery of KR following growing season fire, that's probably the most common pattern I've seen. I've probably done something like 100 or a little more growing season fires, and that's the normal response is KR goes down, bumps back in a couple of years.
I think KR suffered some sort of a setback this year in my area because it just did. Usually you just see it seed out very frequently throughout from spring all the way to fall, but this year it just wasn't as robust like that. I was wondering if it was the ice storm that maybe had an impact on it, but I don't know.
I was really hopeful, but I saw a lot of KR after that ice storm. But yeah, it's definitely not a buffer year, that's for sure, for KR. Bumper year, I should say.
Okay, thank you.
It was kind of surprising to see that you had pointed to that just the one main study that showed that if restoration can work in terms of comparison to the older grasslands. So I guess is the key to that you really have to study them for a long time, you think?
I think restoration works, but you don't generally kind of get all the way there. Like on the lands I work on, if you keep a consistent management regime, you can start to replace KR or juniper breaks with a kind of a medium diversity grassland dominated by what you might call mid-succession species like Texas wintergrass, Texas cupgrass, side oats grama. Some little blue stem will come back in those areas, but yeah, to get to that kind of final step of restoration, really high diversity, really conservative species, that's been elusive to grassland restoration people. And this study from last year is the first one I'm aware of that documents it. And the thing that makes this is different is, 3 decades of consistent volunteer effort on just a couple hundred acres. So on our Slaughter Creek unit, it's located where Slaughter Creek crosses Farm Road 1826, just south of Slaughter Lane is where the gate is. It's some 600 acres, but we have really deep alluvial soils because it's like the floodplain of Slaughter Creek. And more than half of that site has very low levels of King Ranch blue stem, near zero. So I think it's kind of restorable. And I think, that's my vision, that place, if we can, right now what we're doing is we've done some burns, we're solarizing patches, and we've got seed production plots. So people are harvesting from remnant grasslands and from the surrounding landscape. And we're going to try to grow out. We've also got a horticultural pad on that site to kind of grow out these species and harvest seed and hopefully eventually scale up.
I was going to ask you about that. Are you harvesting seed just as a thrifty way to get seed, or are you trying to make sure your seed is local, or that very, very local?
It's really just the species we can't buy. So we spend 15 or 20,000 a year on commercial sources, but the diversity that you can get commercially for the scale we're working at is pretty low. I think we get about a dozen species and a couple 100 pounds of each of them. But we collect, between 60 and 100 species depending on the year. So that's the main reason. I guess there's some benefit certainly to local genotypes, but that's not the main reason.
Okay.
Devin, are there any species that do graze on KR?
Yeah, I mean, once all the more palatable species are gone, cows will eat KR. I think it's very low nutrition. It has a lot of culms or like stems. And so there's not a lot of nutrition in that. So they'll eat all the other grasses, then they'll eat the KR. At some point, it's just prickly pear and they'll eat that too, if that's all they got.
Okay. But nothing goes to that preferentially. Okay.
No, I mean, we're working with John Walker right now out of San Angelo and Sam Fuhlendorf, and there's an idea that if we graze right after burning, the palatability will be better, and that they may target those patches, and that repeated disturbance might negatively impact KR populations, but it's a challenging practice, right? And Norma, your faces you're making, I feel like you have some wisdom to share on this topic.
There's some regenerative farming stuff that's going on in the region where they are using like a series of rooting the area up by pigs, picking it over by chickens, seeding it, and then grazing it by sheep, and then reseeding. And I was wondering if are there any known advantages to doing that kind of thing?
I mean, I saw some plots on the Shield Ranch where they're doing exactly that. I forget the sequence, but there's goats, pigs, chickens, and maybe cows. I don't remember about that. And they've hired Bill Carr, and he's monitoring the plants before and after this sequence. I could imagine if you really controlled where the animals go, that you could really hammer plants that you don't want, and you could allow them to graze plants that you do want. If you move them quickly enough, it should be okay. It's very intensive. Well, the Shield Ranch, they have like 5,000 acres of prairie or something like that. And that's a conservation easement on the WQPL that they have a very healthy land management budget and a pretty large size chunk of country. So they might be able to do something beneficial with that, but it's expensive.
Well, and I'm asking this as sort of I'm a ringer, I guess, because I've gone out and volunteered there and I worked with those folks a couple of times. And I was wondering if there was other evidence of this working. And you're right, it's very labor intensive.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sam Fuhlendorf has published some stuff where he's more interested in the pyrrhic herbivory, but yeah, they've beneficially used livestock to target invasive plants on some sites. There's a whole literature around holistic management that I don't know that some of those ideas apply locally.
I can jump in on this one.
Great, please
Thank
do.
you.
Yeah.
We did not have in this part of the world an animal that rooted up the ground the way hogs do.
Can others hear? It sounds like you're very far away.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on. Give me 1 second.
Come on, Norma.
Oh, I gotta put the ear things on.
Okay. There we go.
There we go. Yeah, hold on. Let me get my headset going. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. We did not historically have native here an animal that does what hogs do. They're basically roto-rooters. So anytime you bring in an animal that does something that the native flora did not historically, evolve with or survive with, you are in very dangerous ground. If it's a lost cause, you've got nothing but KR, and you don't want to use herbicides on it, then the hogs can plow it up for you. You could plow it yourself with farm equipment too, but don't expect that level of digging there's no reason to expect it to be good for the natives, and I've certainly not seen it be good for the natives. What'll come into areas that are hog damaged is the very first, most disturbance tolerance, early successional stuff. The same kind of stuff you would get if you've been on ranches. You know that the area around the stock tanks gets just trampled to pieces. Yeah. Or if you've been up on Fort Hood where they run the tanks through, you get the same thing. Or if you've been someplace where they're running off-road vehicles through heavily, all of these just tear the place up. And you're going to get that same suite of very early successional species coming in. Those are generally not our conservation goal because they're also coming in on roadsides and stuff, you know? The problem with trying to use stock, sheep or cattle or goats, to manage your landscape is there is a theory that if you throw them on at a really high rate, they'll eat everything, whether it's palatable or not. Then you pull them off. And so you don't differentially hit the palatable species. But that tends to, any plant that's on the edge is going to go under that level of grazing or browsing. If you don't hit it that hard, they're going to go for the palatable stuff. And unless the palatable stuff is species of something you want to get rid of, there's no reason to think that a grazing or browsing animal is going to do you much good in terms of your conservation goals. It's sad. I'm sorry to say that, but this is what the literature is telling us. And it makes sense too. If you read the range management literature, this is very well documented.
I really appreciate that. I was struggling on that question a little bit. I think one thing that's neat about it is if you want to do some sort of economically productive or extractive land use, it's pretty neat to try to do what they're doing there, which is bring in a great field botanist to do before and after surveys and really try to learn from it and be really careful about your stocking rate and rotation and all that kind of thing. But yeah, maybe isn't a super promising practice strictly for conservation objectives.
Where it's promising is the fact that much land in this country is not going to come out of economic use. And therefore, whatever we can find out to learn how to make grazing or browsing by goats or whatever hay harvest compatible with biodiversity, native biodiversity is great, because realistically, an awful lot of this area is going to stay in ranches.
Well, what I can say is that they are doing this in an interesting way, because they are very closely monitoring the amount of grazing. Things don't get grazed absolutely, like down to the ground. It's like the sheep get to graze things once and then it's left alone. But that's what makes it very high maintenance. They do this in like small plot segments where they very closely manage the time and amount of grazing that happens and then end that right away so that they have not killed stuff off.
Sure. But the effect is going to be that you're differentially advantaging the less palatable species, and you are differentially disadvantaging the more palatable species. That's just
right. Okay.
Sheep are very selective grazers, extremely. The Brits, who every place is sheep grazed over there, they put cameras on those animals, to actually find out bite by bite. They're extremely selective.
Oh, okay.
More so than cattle, because their mouths are little, and so they can physically be much. They go nip, nip, nip. So they can be much more selective than a cow, where a cow comes up, she wraps her tongue around this wad of grass and yanks her head, jerks her head, and that, that's whatever her tongue wrapped around is what she eats. And a cow tongue is a pretty big thing.
So I've been kind of working with this paleoecological data for a few years, and Norma's helping me to make a more careful interpretation of it. And by the way, I'm at UT in a plant biology PhD program, and Norma's my advisor. I'm really embarrassed. I didn't say that at the beginning.
Co-advisor. Carolyn Ferry is his other advisor.
And so, so I might have been at one point tempted to say, well, we're in the, according to the phylogeny and biogeography study, we're in the evolutionary area of the Chlorodoridae tribe. Many of our native Poaceae are in the Chlorodoridae tribe. And there were these huge, mega herbivores and burrowing animals and all of that kind of stuff. However, according to this recent ancient DNA study from Hall's Cave, which actually fits with a bunch of other studies of this type, those animals all went extinct locally extinct. They were gone from this area in the Younger Dryas. And so, I mentioned some of the key genera and certainly families are constrained from the last glacial maximum to the present. Our flora now, the diversity recovered, not the floristic composition.
No.
So the flora now we have is adapted to shallow soils comparatively. And so like Norm is saying, we should not have a flora here that is used to having deep soils and burrowing animals that do what hogs do.
Yeah.
Good.
Cool.
Well, I guess we have kind of filled the time. And so with that, thank you very much, Devin.
Thank you guys so much for having me. Is this